So in the previous lecture we talked about how GDP was an inefficient measure of our living status. So now we're going to talk about alternative measures to GDP as a more complete measure of both our material and non-material living status. So the first one we're going to talk about is the GPI, or the Genuine Progress Indicator. So the Genuine Progress Indicator. So this indicator was developed in the late 1980s, and it sort of evolved from a measure called the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. So it's developed from the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. This is very important because we note that the government goal is strong and sustainable economic growth, not just economic growth, which is strong. So we want sustainability as well. So what the GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator, does is that it uses GDP data, but then with the GDP data, it doesn't stop there. It then makes, it's pretty dirty, that makes both positive and negative adjustments to basically reflect the positive, so the good and bad effects of consumption and production. So we talked about in our lecture on material living standards that sometimes production can lead to pollution, and this will be a negative effect. And sometimes, because consumption is good, such as vaccines, there will be positive externalities arising from different types of activity. And so what this does, it makes both positive effects and negative adjustments to reflect the good and bad effects of consumption and production. So that's the GPI. So what are the positives of the GPI? So let's look at the positives and negatives of the GPI. Positives, we'll look at a tick, and negatives, we're going to go with a cross. So the positives is that it is also a dollar figure. And so it is very easy to compare between nations. Another positive is that it does take into account the non-material aspects of our living. This is what GDP didn't take into account. So by deducting figures such as environmental damage, depletion of non-renewable resources, reduced leisure time, inequality in the distribution or sharing of income, dependence on foreign debt to finance consumption, defensive expenditures, security, and crime rates. This is more focused on the non-material aspects of our living standards, as opposed to GDP, which only focuses on the positive aspects. And there are also positive additions made to this figure that GDP doesn't actually include. So say the ongoing services provided for by, say, consumer durable household items and from public infrastructure with relatively long lifespans, although they're only included in GDP once, this will actually provide an ongoing effect to our material living standards, and therefore that's going to be an addition to the GPI. So that's how it accounts for different changes or ongoing changes to GDP or our material living status that GDP doesn't actually include. However, disadvantages to this measure include that it is very subjective. So we know that GDP is then manipulated for both positive and negative effects, as per the definition. How do we make an objective discussion of what the value of these adjustments should be? And so that we're going to see that this is very subjective and therefore not represent the entire economy. And sometimes it may be costly to produce as well, because these measures are very difficult to obtain. And so surveys must be conducted, and therefore it's more costly than GDP to produce. So the disadvantages of GPI are that it is subjective, in that people or the company that produces GPI actually has to make subjective and discretionary judgments as to the price dollar value of, say, pollution, or the bad effects of consumption, or the positive effects of production as well. So it is very subjective and can be very costly to produce as well. Okay, so that is the major difference between GDP and GPI, is that perhaps the most important limitation is that these items selected are rather subjective in nature. This is the most important distinction between GDP and GPI. And costly statistical figures, that's a minor need. Okay, so that's what the GPI is. It is developed from an index of sustainable economic welfare and uses GDP data to make both positive and negative adjustments to reflect the good and bad effects of economic activity, such as consumption and production.